David Chen sat at his black piano in his New York apartment. The clock on the wall showed 3:30 in the morning. His fingers moved across the white and black keys like they had done thousands of times before. Each note was perfect. Each sound was exactly right, but David felt nothing. He was 34 years old and one of the best piano players in the world. People came from faraway places just to hear him play. They paid lots of money for tickets to his shows. Newspapers wrote good things about him. Other musicians wanted to be like him. David had everything a piano player could want. But something was wrong. David stopped playing and looked at his hands. They were strong hands that could move fast across the piano keys. These hands had played in the biggest concert halls in the world. Carnegie Hall in New York, the Royal Opera House in London, the Vienna State Opera House in Austria, famous places where only the best musicians got to play. He remembered his first big show 10 years ago. He was so nervous that his hands shook, but when he started playing, everything felt right. The music flowed through him like water. The people in the audience loved it. They stood up and clapped for a long time. David felt like he was flying. Now, 10 years later, David could play the hardest pieces without making any mistakes. He knew every note by heart. His fingers never hit the wrong keys. Music critics said he was like a machine that never broke down. They said this like it was a good thing. But David did not feel good about it. Every day was the same. Wake up at 6 in the morning. Practice for 3 hours. Eat breakfast while reading music sheets. Practice for 3 more hours. Take a short break. Practice until dinner time. Eat dinner alone while thinking about tomorrow's practice. Go to bed and dream about piano keys. His manager, Mrs. Williams, called him every day. She talked about new shows and new places to play. She talked about money and fame. She said David was lucky to be so successful. She said many piano players would do anything to have his life. David knew she was right. He was lucky. He had worked hard since he was 5 years old. His parents brought him to piano lessons every week. They spent all their extra money on a good piano for their small house. They drove him to competitions in other cities. They believed in him when he did not believe in himself. His first teacher was Mrs. Patterson. She was old and kind. She taught him to love music before she taught him to play it well. She would play simple songs and ask David what they made him feel. Happy songs, sad songs, angry songs, peaceful songs. Back then, David could feel the difference. When David got older, he studied with more serious teachers. They cared about technique. They wanted every note to be perfect. They taught him to play exactly like the great masters who wrote the music hundreds of years ago. No mistakes, no personal touches. Just perfect copies of perfect music. David learned well, too well. Now he could play Chopin like Chopin himself. He could play Mozart like Mozart. He could play Beethoven like Beethoven. But he could not play like David Chen. He had forgotten how to put his own feelings into the music. The worst part was the audiences. They came to hear David Chen, the famous piano player. They expected perfection. They expected him to play every note exactly right. If he made even one small mistake, some people would notice. They would write bad reviews. They would say David was getting old or tired or losing his skill, so David never made mistakes anymore. But he never felt joy anymore either. He looked around his expensive apartment. It had white walls and expensive furniture. Everything was clean and perfect, just like his music. There were awards on the shelves, photos of him with famous people, newspaper articles with his name in big letters. But the apartment felt empty. It felt like a museum where no one really lived. David had no close friends. Other musicians were either competition or fans. He had tried dating, but relationships were hard when he traveled all the time. Women got tired of coming second to piano practice. David got tired of explaining why music had to come first. His parents had died 3 years ago in a car accident. They never got to see him become really famous. David played at their funeral. It was the last time he remembered feeling something real while playing piano. Now David played the same pieces over and over. Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2, Chopin's Ballades, Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsodies. Beautiful music that other people wrote. Music that came from their hearts and their lives and their feelings. But when David played these pieces, they felt empty, like beautiful clothes on a store dummy, pretty to look at but with no life inside. David stood up from the piano and walked to his window. New York City was quiet at this time of night. Only a few cars drove down the street. A few lights were on in other buildings. Most people were sleeping, dreaming their own dreams. David wondered what it would be like to have different dreams. Dreams that were not about perfect performances and standing ovations. Dreams about playing music that made him feel alive again. He went back to the piano and sat down. His fingers found the keys automatically. They started playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Every note was perfect. Every phrase was exactly right, and David felt absolutely nothing at all. David had 3 weeks with no concerts planned. This was rare for him. Usually his schedule was full of shows and travel and practice. But his manager, Mrs. Williams, said he needed a break. She said he looked tired during his last performance in Boston. David did not know what to do with free time anymore. He had forgotten how to relax. On the first day, he practiced piano for 8 hours anyway. On the second day, he tried to read a book, but his mind kept thinking about finger exercises. By the third day, he felt restless and strange. He decided to visit San Francisco. This was where he grew up. His childhood home was sold after his parents died, but David wanted to see his old neighborhood again. Maybe walking around familiar streets would help him feel better. The flight from New York to San Francisco took 6 hours. David sat in first class and stared out the window. He watched the country pass by below him, fields and mountains and cities that looked like toy models from so high up. He tried to remember the last time he had taken a trip that was not for work. He could not remember. David rented a car at the airport and drove to his old neighborhood. Many things had changed. New houses stood where empty lots used to be. Old houses were painted different colors. The corner store where he used to buy candy was now a coffee shop. But some things were the same. The big oak tree on Maple Street was still there, bigger than before. The elementary school looked exactly like David remembered. The park where he used to play had the same old swings and slides. David parked his car and started walking. It was a warm afternoon. The sun felt good on his face. He had been inside practice rooms and concert halls for so long that he almost forgot what natural sunlight felt like. He walked past his old house. New people lived there now. They had painted it yellow instead of white. There were different flowers in the front yard. A little girl was playing in the driveway with chalk, drawing pictures on the concrete. She looked up at David and waved. He waved back and kept walking. At the end of the street was the community center. David remembered this place. His mom used to bring him here for after-school programs when he was young. They had arts and crafts classes and sports teams. David never joined anything because he was always too busy with piano lessons. The building looked older now. The paint was peeling a little bit. Some of the windows had cracks, but it still looked friendly and welcoming. As David walked by, he heard something that made him stop. It was a piano, but this was not like any piano playing David had heard in years. This was not perfect. This was not technical. This was something else entirely. Someone was playing just one note, a single key pressed down and held for a long time, but the way they played that note made David's chest feel tight. There was something in that sound that he had not heard in his own playing for years. The note had feeling in it. David stood on the sidewalk and listened. The person playing let the note fade away completely before pressing it again. Same note, but somehow different each time. Sometimes stronger, sometimes softer, sometimes quick, sometimes slow. Like the note was talking and saying different things each time. David found himself walking toward the building. He did not plan to do this. His feet just moved by themselves. He followed the sound to a window that was open a few inches. Very quietly, he looked inside. An old man sat at an upright piano. The piano was old too, with scratches on the wooden case and some keys that looked yellow with age. The man had gray hair and brown skin with lots of wrinkles. His hands were not smooth like David's hands. They looked like hands that had worked hard for many years. The old man's eyes were closed. He was still playing that same single note, but now he was adding other notes one at a time. Not like a song that David knew. More like a conversation between the notes. Like each note was answering the note that came before it. David had studied music theory for 20 years. He knew about scales and chords and harmony. He could analyze any piece of music and tell you exactly how it was built. But what this old man was playing did not follow any rules that David knew. And yet it was beautiful. The old man opened his eyes and saw David watching through the window. David felt embarrassed, like he had been caught doing something wrong. He started to walk away, but the old man smiled and waved him inside. David hesitated. He was used to being recognized when he met other musicians. People usually got excited and asked him to sign things or take pictures. David was not sure he wanted to deal with that right now. But something about the old man's smile made David feel safe. He walked around to the front door and went inside. The community center was quiet. David's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he walked toward the room with the piano. When he got there, the old man was still sitting at the bench, but he was not playing anymore. "Hello," the old man said. His voice was warm and friendly. "I'm Marcus Rivera. You looked like you were enjoying the music." David introduced himself, but he did not mention that he was famous. He just said his name was David and that he played piano too. Marcus nodded like this was interesting, but not surprising. "What kind of piano do you play?" he asked. David was not sure how to answer this question. "Classical music mostly," he said. "Chopin, Mozart, Beethoven, that kind of thing." Marcus smiled. "I mean, what kind of piano do you play? Do you play piano that comes from your head, or piano that comes from your heart?" David did not understand the question. He had never thought about piano coming from different places. Piano came from years of practice and muscle memory and knowing exactly which keys to press when. Marcus seemed to understand David's confusion. "Here, let me show you," he said. He turned back to the piano and started playing again. This time he played a simple melody that David recognized. It was Amazing Grace, an old hymn that everyone knew. But Marcus played it in a way that David had never heard before. He changed some of the notes. He added pauses in unexpected places. He made some parts louder and some parts quieter in ways that were not written in any music book. When Marcus finished, David realized that his eyes were wet. He could not remember the last time music had made him want to cry. "That was beautiful," David said quietly. Marcus smiled again. "That was just me having a conversation with an old song," he said. "The song tells me one thing, and I tell it something back. That's all music really is, a conversation." David had never thought about music as a conversation before. He had always thought about it as a performance. Something to do perfectly in front of people who would judge whether he did it right or wrong. "Would you like to try?" Marcus asked, moving over on the piano bench to make room. David sat down next to the stranger and looked at the old piano keys. They felt different under his fingers. Not as smooth as his expensive piano at home. Some of them stuck a little bit when he pressed them down. But somehow David was not thinking about perfection anymore. He was thinking about conversation. David came back to the community center the next day. He told himself he was just curious. He wanted to understand what Marcus had meant about music being a conversation. David had learned many things about piano in his life, but no one had ever talked about it this way. Marcus was there again, sitting at the same old piano. He was playing something that sounded like jazz, but David was not sure. The music moved and changed like water flowing around rocks in a stream. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always moving somewhere new. "Hello, David," Marcus said without looking up from the keys. "I was wondering if you would come back." David sat down in a folding chair near the piano. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said yesterday, about music being a conversation." Marcus finished the phrase he was playing and turned to look at David. "Most people think music is about showing off how well they can play, but music is really about sharing feelings, like talking to a friend but using sounds instead of words." This was very different from what David had learned in his 29 years of piano lessons. His teachers had always focused on technique. How to hold his hands correctly, how to press the keys with the right amount of force, how to play exactly what was written on the page, no more and no less. "I don't think I know how to do that," David admitted. "I know how to play pieces correctly. I know how to play them the way the composer wanted them played, but I don't know how to have a conversation with music." Marcus smiled and patted the piano bench next to him. "Sit down. Let's start with something simple." David sat down and put his hands on the keyboard. He automatically positioned his fingers the way his first teacher had shown him when he was 5 years old. Curved fingers, straight wrists, relaxed shoulders. "Forget all that," Marcus said gently. "Just put your hands on the keys like you're touching a friend's shoulder. Comfortable, natural." David tried to relax his hands, but it felt wrong. He had trained his body to hold itself in certain ways for so many years that anything else felt like making a mistake. "Now," Marcus said, "I want you to play one note, any note. But before you play it, I want you to think about how you feel right now in this moment." David thought about this. How did he feel? He felt confused and a little bit scared. He felt curious but also worried that he would do something wrong. He felt tired from years of perfect performances and excited about the possibility of something new. He pressed middle C, the note in the center of the piano. "Good," Marcus said. "Now play it again, but this time think about something that makes you happy." David thought about his parents. He remembered Sunday mornings when he was little, when his mom would make pancakes and his dad would read the newspaper out loud. The house would smell like syrup and coffee and everything felt safe and warm. He pressed middle C again. Somehow, even though it was the same note, it sounded different. "Did you hear that?" Marcus asked. It sounded warmer, maybe. Exactly. The note itself didn't change, but you changed. And when you change, your music changes too. That's the beginning of conversation. For the next hour, Marcus had David play the same note while thinking about different things. Sad memories made the note sound darker. Angry thoughts made it sound sharp and harsh. Peaceful thoughts made it sound soft and calm. David had never paid attention to this before. In all his years of training, he had focused on playing notes correctly, not on how the notes made him feel or how his feelings changed the notes. "This is very strange," David said finally. "I can play the most difficult pieces in the world, but playing one note with feeling is harder than anything I've ever done." Marcus laughed. "That's because you've been learning to play like someone else for so long that you forgot how to play like yourself." David came back every day for the next week. Each day, Marcus would give him simple exercises that had nothing to do with technique or speed or accuracy. They would work on playing one note with different emotions, then 2 notes having a conversation with each other, then 3 notes telling a simple story. It was frustrating for David. He was used to learning new things quickly. He could memorize a complicated piece of music in a few days, but these simple exercises felt impossible. Every time he tried to put feeling into his playing, his trained habits would take over. His fingers would move to familiar patterns. His mind would think about correct fingering and proper timing. "Stop trying so hard," Marcus would say. "Music is not a test you have to pass. It's a language you speak with your heart." David had never thought about music as a language before. He knew about musical theory and structure and form. He knew that certain chords created certain moods and that certain rhythms made people want to dance or cry or feel peaceful. But he had never thought about actually talking with music. "What are you trying to say when you play?" Marcus asked one afternoon. David had been playing a simple melody, trying to make it sound sad. But instead of sadness, the music sounded mechanical and empty. "I don't know," David said honestly. "I'm not trying to say anything. I'm just trying to play the notes correctly." "That's your problem," Marcus said. "You're speaking musical words, but you're not saying anything. It's like reading a dictionary out loud instead of having a conversation." Marcus sat down at the piano and played the same simple melody. But when he played it, David could hear sadness in every note. Not because Marcus was trying to sound sad, but because Marcus was remembering something that made him feel sad. And that feeling came through his fingers into the music. "I was thinking about my wife," Marcus explained. "She died 5 years ago. When I miss her, my music sounds different than when I'm happy or angry or excited. I'm not trying to make it sound different. It just does." David realized that he had been thinking about music backwards his whole life. He had been trying to make his feelings fit the music instead of letting the music come from his feelings. "How do I unlearn 30 years of training?" David asked. Marcus smiled. "The same way you learned it in the first place. One day at a time. One note at a time. But this time you're not learning to be perfect. You're learning to be yourself." That night David went back to his hotel room and sat at the small keyboard he had brought with him. He tried to practice the way Marcus had taught him, playing simple notes with feeling instead of complicated pieces with perfect technique. It was the hardest thing he had ever tried to do, but for the first time in years, David felt like he was learning something new about music, instead of just repeating things he already knew. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe he had spent so many years learning to play like other people that he had forgotten how to play like himself. Maybe it was time to remember. David had been working with Marcus for 2 weeks when his phone started ringing constantly. Mrs. Williams, his manager, was calling every few hours. David had been ignoring the calls, but finally he answered. "David, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for days." Mrs. Williams sounded worried and angry at the same time. "I'm in San Francisco," David said. "I told you I was taking a break." "A break doesn't mean disappearing completely. We have the Chicago Symphony performance next month, remember? You need to start preparing. And the recording studio wants to know when you can come in to finish the Chopin album." David had forgotten about these commitments. For the first time in his adult life, music business had not been the most important thing on his mind. "I'll be ready," David said, though he was not sure this was true. "You'd better be." The Chicago performance is sold out. 15,000 people, David. This is not something you can just wing. After hanging up, David felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on his shoulders again. 15,000 people who would pay money to hear David Chen play perfect classical music. 15,000 people who expected him to be the machine-like pianist they had read about in reviews. But David was not feeling like a machine anymore. Marcus had been teaching him to feel music instead of just playing it correctly. This felt important and new and exciting, but it also felt dangerous. What if he went to Chicago and could not play perfectly anymore? What if all these weeks of learning to feel music had broken his ability to perform the way people expected? David decided not to tell Marcus about the phone call. Instead, he went to the community center as usual. "You look worried today," Marcus said when David sat down at the piano. "I'm fine," David lied. Marcus had been teaching David to play simple folk songs and jazz standards, songs that most people knew, but played in Marcus's style of conversation rather than performance. Today they were working on Somewhere Over the Rainbow. David played the melody, trying to put feeling into each note the way Marcus had taught him. He thought about hope and dreams and wishing for something better. The music sounded more alive than his usual perfect performances, but it also sounded messy and uncertain. "Better," Marcus said, "but you're still thinking too much. Music doesn't come from your brain, David. It comes from your heart and your hands working together without your brain getting in the way." "But I need my brain," David said. "I have to remember which notes to play and when to play them." "Do you use your brain when you walk?" Marcus asked. "What do you mean? When you walk across the room, do you think left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot? Or do you just walk?" David understood what Marcus meant. Walking was so natural that he never thought about it. His body just knew how to do it. "Music should be the same way," Marcus continued. "After 30 years of playing piano, your hands know where the notes are. Your body knows how to make music. You just have to stop thinking so hard and let it happen." This was the opposite of everything David had been taught. His teachers had always emphasized thinking and planning and control. Every note should be deliberate. Every phrase should be calculated. Nothing should be left to chance. But when David tried to play without thinking, something magical happened. His hands moved to notes that felt right instead of notes that were written on a page. The music became more like breathing than performing. "There," Marcus said when David finished playing. "That sounded like you." David was not sure he knew what he sounded like anymore. For so many years he had sounded like Chopin or Mozart or Rachmaninoff. He had never tried to sound like David Chen. "Marcus," David said, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Did you ever perform for big audiences? Did you ever have to play perfectly for thousands of people?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I played in jazz clubs mostly. Small places where people came to drink and talk and listen to music. Sometimes there were 50 people, sometimes 10. I never played in concert halls like you do." David felt a pang of disappointment. How could Marcus understand the pressure David faced if he had never experienced it himself? Marcus seemed to sense David's thoughts. "You're wondering if I know what it's like to have thousands of people watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake." "Yes," David admitted. "I don't know what that feels like," Marcus said honestly. "But I know what it feels like to be so worried about playing perfectly that you forget why you started playing music in the first place." This hit David hard. Why had he started playing music? He tried to remember being 5 years old at his first piano lesson with Mrs. Patterson. She had played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and asked David to play it back. When he pressed the keys and heard the melody come out, he had felt amazed that he could make such beautiful sounds. When was the last time David had felt amazed by music? "I have a performance next month," David said finally. 15,000 people. They're expecting me to play Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2 perfectly. No mistakes, no surprises, exactly like they've heard it 100 times before. "What do you want to give them?" Marcus asked. David thought about this. "I want to give them something real, something that comes from my heart instead of just my fingers. But I'm scared they won't understand. I'm scared they'll think I've lost my ability." Marcus nodded. "Fear is the enemy of music. When you're afraid, you can't have a conversation. You can only recite words you've memorized." For the next week, Marcus worked with David on playing without fear. This was even harder than playing with feeling. David's whole career was built on never making mistakes, never taking risks, never doing anything that might sound wrong to someone else. But Marcus taught him that mistakes were not the enemy. In jazz, we don't call them mistakes, Marcus said. We call them explorations. If you play a note that sounds wrong, you just play another note that makes the first note sound right. David tried this approach with a piece he knew well, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Instead of playing it exactly as written, he allowed himself to add notes that felt right in the moment. Sometimes they sounded good, sometimes they sounded strange, but the music felt alive in a way it never had before. This is terrifying, David told Marcus. Good, Marcus replied. If you're not a little bit scared, you're not really living. You're just going through the motions. David's phone kept ringing with calls from Mrs. Williams, the Chicago Symphony conductor, and music journalists who wanted to interview him about the upcoming performance. David ignored most of the calls. He was too busy learning how to play music like himself instead of like someone else. But as the weeks passed, David began to worry. He had spent his entire adult life building a reputation for perfection. What would happen if he went to Chicago and played like Marcus had taught him? What would happen if he chose conversation over perfection? What would happen if 15,000 people heard David Chen's real voice for the first time? The day of the Chicago Symphony performance arrived like a storm that David had been watching approach for weeks. He woke up in his hotel room feeling like two different people were fighting inside his head. One person was the old David Chen, the perfect classical pianist who never made mistakes. The other person was someone new, someone who had learned to speak with music instead of just reciting it. David had not practiced the Rachmaninoff concerto in the traditional way for over a month. Instead, he had been working with Marcus on feeling and conversation and playing from the heart. Part of David wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his career. Mrs. Williams met him at the concert hall for the afternoon rehearsal. She looked worried as she watched David walk across the stage to the piano. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra was already seated and ready to play. "Are you feeling all right?" she whispered to David before he sat down. "You look different." David did feel different. For the first time in years, he felt nervous before a performance. Not nervous about making mistakes, but nervous about whether he would have the courage to be himself in front of 15,000 people. The rehearsal began. David played the opening of the concerto the way he had played it hundreds of times before. Perfect notes, perfect timing, perfect technique. The orchestra followed along easily. They knew this piece well, and they knew David's usual interpretation of it. But as the rehearsal continued, David felt something building inside him. The music felt dead and mechanical. He was playing the notes that Rachmaninoff wrote, but he was not saying anything with them. He was reciting instead of conversing. Halfway through the first movement, David did something he had never done in a rehearsal before. He stopped playing exactly what was written and started adding his own voice to the conversation. He played a phrase more softly than usual, with a sadness that came from his own experience rather than from the sheet music. He added a small pause that was not written anywhere but felt right in the moment. The orchestra looked confused. This was not how David Chen usually played. The conductor raised his eyebrows but kept conducting. After the rehearsal, Mrs. Williams pulled David aside. "What was that?" she asked. "You were playing differently than usual. Is everything okay?" David did not know how to explain what had been happening to him over the past month. "I'm fine," he said. "I'm just trying some new interpretations. Tonight is not the time for experiments, David. 15,000 people paid to hear David Chen play Rachmaninoff. They want the David Chen they know from recordings and reviews." But David was not sure he could be the David Chen anymore. Marcus had taught him that music was supposed to come from inside the person playing it. How could he go back to being a copying machine after learning how to be himself? That evening, David stood backstage listening to the audience take their seats. He could hear thousands of voices talking and laughing. Programs rustling, chairs creaking. All those people had come to hear him play. Marcus had driven up from San Francisco to attend the performance. David had gotten him a ticket in the front row. Before going on stage, David found Marcus backstage. "I don't know if I can do this," David said. "What if I play from my heart and they hate it? What if I ruin my career?" Marcus put his hand on David's shoulder. "What if you play from your heart and finally become the musician you were meant to be? But what if I make mistakes? Then you'll make beautiful mistakes. And maybe some of those mistakes will turn into discoveries." The stage manager called for David to take his place. He walked out onto the stage and saw 15,000 people looking at him. The lights were bright and hot. The orchestra was ready. The conductor was waiting. David sat down at the concert grand piano. His hands found their positions on the keys. This was the moment when he had to choose between the old David and the new David. The conductor raised his baton. The orchestra began playing the opening of Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2. David had heard this opening thousands of times. He knew exactly when to come in and exactly which notes to play. But when his moment arrived, David made a choice. Instead of playing the notes exactly as written, he played them as a conversation with the orchestra. He let his recent experiences with Marcus flow through his fingers. He thought about learning to feel music again. He thought about his parents and their love for music. He thought about the young boy who had first touched piano keys and felt amazed by the sounds he could make. At first, the difference was subtle. The audience might not have noticed anything unusual, but as the first movement continued, David's playing became more and more personal. He was still playing Rachmaninoff's notes, but he was speaking them in his own voice. The orchestra began to respond to David's new approach. The conductor started following David's emotional cues instead of just the written tempo markings. The music became a real conversation between David and the 90 musicians on stage with him. Some people in the audience began to lean forward in their seats. This was not the mechanical perfection they expected from David Chen. This was something more dangerous and more alive. By the second movement, David was fully committed to this new way of playing. He let himself feel the sadness and beauty of Rachmaninoff's music instead of just executing it correctly. When he played the famous melody that everyone knew, he played it like he was telling a story from his own life. The audience was completely quiet. Even the people who usually coughed or rustled programs during performances were still and listening. But in the third movement, something unexpected happened. David began to play notes that were not written in the original score. They were not wrong notes. They were additional notes that felt like they belonged, like they were part of a conversation David was having with Rachmaninoff himself. The orchestra struggled to follow him. Some musicians looked confused. The conductor had to make quick decisions about how to keep the orchestra together, while David explored musical territory that no one had planned for. By the final movement, David was playing music that was both Rachmaninoff and David Chen at the same time. It was risky and imperfect and completely alive. Some phrases were more beautiful than any recording David had ever made. Other phrases were rough and uncertain. When the concerto ended, there was a moment of complete silence in the concert hall. 15,000 people sat perfectly still, not sure what they had just heard. Then someone in the balcony started clapping. Others joined in. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, applauding louder than David had ever heard before. But as David stood up and bowed, he could see that not everyone was happy. Some people in the expensive seats looked confused and upset. Music critics in the press section were writing furiously in their notebooks. Mrs. Williams stood in the wings with her mouth open, looking shocked. David had done exactly what Marcus had taught him to do. He had played from his heart instead of from memory. He had chosen conversation over perfection. But looking at the mixed reactions around him, David realized that this choice would change everything about his life and career. There was no going back to being a machine now. The reviews came out the next morning and they split the classical music world in half. The Chicago Tribune's music critic wrote, "David Chen's performance last night was either a breakthrough or a breakdown. Gone was the mechanical precision we've come to expect. In its place was something raw, personal, and utterly unpredictable. Chen seemed to be improvising on Rachmaninoff, adding his own voice to a masterpiece that needs no improvement. The result was either inspired or self-indulgent depending on your perspective." The New York Times was harsher. "David Chen appears to have lost his way. What was once disciplined artistry has become undisciplined self-expression." The audience may have applauded, but serious classical music lovers will be disappointed by this departure from the standards that made Chen famous. But other reviews were different. A young critic from a music blog wrote, "Last night, David Chen reminded us why we fell in love with music in the first place. His performance was not perfect, but it was alive in a way that perfect performances never are. Chen took risks and some of them didn't work. But the ones that did work were breathtaking." David read all the reviews in his hotel room the morning after the performance. Mrs. Williams had been calling since 6 in the morning, but David was not ready to talk to her yet. His phone buzzed with a text message from a number he did not recognize. "Saw the performance online. You changed my life. Thank you. Sarah, music student, Boston. Then another message from a different number. I'm a pianist too. Last night you showed me it's okay to play with feeling instead of just technique. Thank you. More messages kept coming. Young musicians from around the country who had watched the performance online or heard recordings of it, they were thanking David for showing them that classical music could be personal and emotional instead of just perfect. But there were negative messages too. Older musicians and classical music fans who felt that David had betrayed the traditions of classical performance. They said he was being selfish and showing off instead of serving the music. David finally answered when Mrs. Williams called for the 10th time. "David, we need to talk," she said without saying hello. "What happened last night?" "I played music," David said. "That wasn't music, that was... I don't know what that was, but it wasn't what people paid to hear. The Philadelphia Orchestra called this morning. They want to know if you're going to play the scheduled program next month, or if you're going to do more of this experimental stuff." "What did you tell them?" "I told them you were going through a phase and that everything would be back to normal soon." "Please tell me that's true, David." David looked out his hotel window at the Chicago skyline. People were walking to work, starting their normal days. But David's life felt anything but normal. "I don't think I can go back to playing the old way," David said honestly. Mrs. Williams was quiet for a long moment. "David, you have built a career on reliability. People book you because they know exactly what they're going to get. If you start changing your style randomly, you'll lose that reliability." "Maybe I don't want to be reliable anymore." "Do you realize what you're saying? You could lose everything. The major orchestras, the recording contracts, the international tours, everything we've worked for." After hanging up, David felt scared and excited at the same time. He had spent his entire adult life being the person that other people expected him to be. What would happen if he started being himself instead? Over the next few days, the consequences of David's performance became clear. The Philadelphia Orchestra did cancel his upcoming performance. A recording company put his new album on hold pending a meeting to discuss his artistic direction. 2 major concert halls in Europe sent polite emails saying they were reassessing their future collaborations with David, but other things happened too. 3 music schools invited David to give masterclasses on personal expression in classical music. A jazz festival asked if he would be interested in performing. Young musicians started reaching out to work with him on projects that mixed classical and contemporary styles. The strangest thing was the reaction from other classical musicians. Older, established players were mostly critical or silent. But younger musicians, especially those who felt trapped by the pressure to play perfectly, reached out privately to thank David. A violinist from the New York Philharmonic sent an email. "I've been playing professionally for 15 years, and I felt dead inside for most of that time. Your performance reminded me that music is supposed to mean something." A pianist from Germany wrote, "I've been wanting to add my own voice to the pieces I play, but I was afraid. After seeing what you did, I'm ready to try." David realized that he was not the only classical musician who felt trapped by perfectionism. There were others who wanted to express themselves through music, but were afraid of being criticized or losing their careers. A week after the Chicago performance, David was back in San Francisco visiting Marcus. They sat at the old piano in the community center, and David told Marcus about everything that had happened. "Are you sorry you took the risk?" Marcus asked. David thought about this question. He had lost some important career opportunities. Some people were angry with him. His future was uncertain in a way it had never been before. "No," David said finally. "I'm not sorry. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm actually making music instead of just playing notes." "What will you do now?" "I don't know exactly, but I know I can't go back to playing like a machine, even if it means my career changes completely." Marcus smiled. "You know what I think you should do?" "What?" "I think you should teach other musicians what you've learned. There are a lot of young players out there who are struggling with the same things you struggled with. They need someone to show them that it's okay to be themselves." David had never thought about teaching before. His whole life had been focused on performing. But the emails and messages from young musicians had shown him that there were others who needed to learn what Marcus had taught him. "How would I even start?" David asked. "The same way you started learning to play from your heart," Marcus said. "One note at a time. One student at a time. One conversation at a time." David looked at the old piano where he had first learned to put feeling into his music. Maybe losing his old career was not the end of something. Maybe it was the beginning of something better. Maybe he could help other musicians find their own voices instead of just copying the voices of people who came before them. Maybe the risk had been worth it after all. 6 months after the Chicago performance that changed everything, David stood outside a small jazz club in San Francisco called the Blue Note. It was nothing like the grand concert halls where he used to perform. The building was old and small, with a simple wooden door and a hand-painted sign. But David felt more excited than he had before any performance in his life. Tonight was different from anything David had ever done. Instead of playing alone with an orchestra, he was performing with a small group of musicians. Instead of playing only classical music, his program mixed pieces by Bach and Chopin with jazz standards and even some songs he had written himself. Most importantly, instead of trying to play perfectly, David was planning to play honestly. Marcus arrived early and found David backstage, which was really just a small room behind the club's tiny stage. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked. "Terrified," David said, smiling. "But it's a good kind of terrified. Like the feeling you get before doing something that might change your life." Over the past 6 months, David's life had changed completely. He had lost some of his traditional classical music career, but he had gained something more valuable. He had found his own voice as a musician. The process had not been easy. David had to learn to live with less money and fewer fancy hotels. Some of his old friends in the classical music world stopped talking to him. Music critics still argued about whether his new style was brilliant or foolish. But David had also discovered a whole new world of musicians and music lovers. Jazz players welcomed him into their community and taught him about improvisation and collaboration. Young classical musicians sought him out for lessons in playing with emotion instead of just technique. David had started teaching master classes at music schools around the country. Instead of focusing on perfect technique, these classes taught students how to find their own musical voices. The classes were always full, with waiting lists of young musicians who were tired of being machines and wanted to learn how to be artists. "The hardest part," David would tell his students, "is not learning to play with feeling. The hardest part is giving yourself permission to be imperfect." Tonight's performance was special because it represented everything David had learned. He would be playing with Marcus, who had become not just his teacher but his friend. They were joined by a young jazz bassist named Elena, who had grown up listening to classical music, and a drummer named Carlos who could make any rhythm feel like a conversation. The audience at the Blue Note was different from David's old audiences too. Instead of people in expensive suits sitting in silent rows, this crowd was mixed. Young and old, classical music lovers and jazz fans, professional musicians, and people who just loved music. They sat at small tables drinking coffee and wine, talking quietly while they waited for the show to begin. David peeked through the curtain and saw about 80 people in the audience. It was a tiny fraction of the 15,000 who had heard him in Chicago, but somehow it felt more important. "Ladies and gentlemen," the club owner announced, "please welcome David Chen, Marcus Rivera, Elena Santos, and Carlos Washington." David walked onto the small stage and sat down at an old upright piano similar to the one where he had first learned to play with feeling. The piano was not perfectly tuned and some of the keys stuck slightly, but David had learned that imperfection could be beautiful. "Good evening," David said to the audience. 6 months ago, I thought music was about playing notes correctly. Tonight, I want to share with you what I've learned about music being a conversation between friends." They started with a piece David had written himself, inspired by his first meeting with Marcus. It began with a single note held for a long time, just like the note that had first caught David's attention at the community center. Gradually, the other instruments joined in, each adding their own voice to the conversation. David found himself smiling as he played. The music felt alive and unpredictable. When Elena played a bass line that surprised him, David responded with piano phrases he had never played before. When Carlos added an unexpected rhythm, the whole group adjusted and found new ways to make the music work. This was the opposite of his old performances, where every note was planned and rehearsed until it was perfect. Tonight, the music was being created in real time, shaped by the mood of the room and the chemistry between the musicians. Next, they played Bach's Air on the G string, but arranged as a jazz ballad. David had learned that classical pieces could be starting points for new conversations, rather than museum pieces that had to be preserved exactly as written. Bach's beautiful melody was still there, but it was dressed in new harmonies and rhythms that made it feel fresh and alive. The audience listened in a way David had never experienced before. Instead of sitting silently and waiting to applaud at the end, people responded to the music as it happened. Someone would nod when a phrase moved them. Others would smile when the musicians played something unexpected. A few people had tears in their eyes during the softer moments. Halfway through the performance, David played a solo version of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, the song Marcus had first taught him to play with feeling. As he played, David thought about his journey from mechanical perfection to emotional honesty. The song became a story about hope and transformation and the courage to become who you really are. When the song ended, the audience was completely quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping softly, and others joined in with gentle applause that felt more like gratitude than approval. For the final piece, the group played a jazz standard called Round Midnight, with each musician taking turns leading the conversation. When David's solo came, he found himself playing things he had never practiced, melodies that came from somewhere deep inside him that he had only recently learned to access. Marcus smiled at him from across the stage. David remembered their first conversation about music being like talking to a friend. Tonight, that's exactly what it felt like. 4 friends having a musical conversation while 80 other friends listened in. When the performance ended, the audience stood and applauded for a long time. But more importantly to David, people came up afterward to talk about how the music had made them feel. A young woman said the performance had inspired her to start playing piano again after giving up for years. An older man said he had never understood jazz before, but now he wanted to learn more. Several young musicians in the audience asked David about his teaching and masterclasses. They wanted to learn how to play with emotion instead of just technique. The most important thing, David told them, is to remember that music is not about impressing people with how well you can play. Music is about sharing something real with other people. As the club emptied out, David sat at the piano and played quietly for himself. Marcus came over and sat next to him on the bench. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked. "Like I finally know who I am as a musician," David said. "It took me 34 years, but I finally understand what you meant about music being a conversation." "You know what the best part is?" Marcus said. "What?" "Now you can teach other people to have their own conversations with music. You can help them find their voices instead of just copying other people's voices." David looked out at the empty club. Tomorrow he would go back to teaching his master classes and working with young musicians who were struggling with the same things he had struggled with. He would help them learn that being perfect was less important than being real. It was not the career David had planned when he was young, but it was the career that felt right for who he had become. David played one final note on the old piano and let it fade into silence. It was not a perfect note, but it was honest. It came from his heart and spoke in his own voice. And that made all the difference.